I would like to say thank you and welcome to Alain Bertaud, who is once again, this is the 6th of 7 urban lunches that he has attended from Manhattan, and we're so grateful for that. And we'd like him to maybe say a few words at the end if he's open to that. Note about our public salons: we've changed our public salon format to have one international speaker with local responders. On October 26th, we will host Michael Schellenberger at the Vancouver Playhouse. He is the author of San Francisco, which has a great relevance to the way we deal with, or possibly more accurately, don't deal with drug addiction and mental illness and the scandalous overdose crisis that we are in the midst of. We thank Alain and Marianne. We're excited to present 2 passionate urbanists at this urban lunch, Michael Geller and Tom Davidoff. And we're also very grateful to have Sebastian Zane, who's joined us again. He's managed the Q&A for us on all of these sessions, and we're so grateful that he's come back again. So Michael Geller, a little bit about him. I'm not going to say much. I can say that he just celebrated his 50th anniversary in Vancouver as architect, planner, real estate consultant, developer. During this time, he wrote for the Vancouver Courier, the Vancouver Sun, served on CKNW Civic Affair panel with Francis Beulah and the late Jim Green, and is adjunct faculty at the SFU Center for Sustainable Development. And we all know that Michael Geller really drove that whole SFU University as president and CEO. He has attended many, well, I actually want to just say a personal thank you to him when I launched something we call Eco-Density. Michael was right there front and center, and he's always been so involved in the public discourse about community and development. Michael has attended many world expositions around the world, and today he would like to take all of us on a global tour of just a few of the 192 pavilions at Expo 2020 Dubai, showcasing innovations, sustainability, mobility, and opportunity. Michael, thank you for being here. Take it away.
I am going to take it away because I have a lot of slides and I want to make sure I leave enough time for Tom Davidoff. Tom kindly sent me his presentation. He doesn't have that many slides, but I looked through them and the only ones I could understand were the ones with pictures. So I want to make sure he has enough time to explain these slides to all of you. The other thing is, although Tom and I are talking about very different topics, I am confident that we'll find a number of items at the end of the discussion to disagree upon. So with that, let's get started. As Sam said, I have been to many world fairs, and I suspect many of you have. And one of the reasons I love going to them is you get a chance to see tomorrow. I didn't get to the 1853 World Fair where the elevator was unveiled, nor did I get to any of these fairs where indeed many of the things that we now take for granted were innovations that were first introduced at world fairs. Often in the case of cars, the Mustang, but also the first hydrogen car, the touch screen TV, the video telephone, and so forth. Quite a few innovations. Although some of them didn't catch on right away. I found it interesting, for instance, that the fax machine was first introduced in 1851. The zipper also introduced a long time ago. And of course, a couple of these innovations have not yet achieved common usage, although I understand jetpacks are now available. I suspect most of you are not aware that this World Fair has been in planning for the last 6-7 years and is now underway and will continue until the end of March. But Dubai, I thought, what an interesting place for a World Fair, especially one with a theme of sustainability, because although it's true that the UAE is a place where the impossible doesn't exist, I suspect many of us are aware that this is our impression of Dubai, hardly a model of sustainability. And that is not Photoshop. That is exactly what it looks like from the air. It also looks like this. And so again, the juxtaposition of a fair dealing with sustainability and mobility in a town, I thought will be fascinating. I arrived at the first gate, and the first thing that greeted me was this logo mark in the ground proclaiming the global goals of sustainable development. And indeed, they became a theme throughout this entire exhibition. As Sam mentioned, there were 192 participating countries. Sadly, I didn't get to all of the pavilions, but I did get to a large number. And one day I'll come back and share with you pictures for those that I don't show today. But I wanted to put up this slide because we're all familiar with these three intersecting circles of sustainability, because they were used as the site planning framework for the fair. And those three key, districts were mobility, sustainability, opportunity, with secondary districts as well. Gordon Price was going to come with me, and Gordon is with us today, and he arranged for us to stay on the hotel, at a hotel on the site. And to just prove how sustainable it was, the hotel room keys were made out of wood. The other thing is, many people question, why would you be going to a World Fair with COVID? In fact, it really was very, very well managed in that respect, in case some of you decide to go. And as you will see from the middle, having learned from past fairs, having media accreditation is a wonderful way to not have to stand at the back of every lineup. So these were my first impressions of the fair, and it really was designed for the pedestrian with a lot of cover, because although the temperature was not too hot, it was generally between 20 and 27 every day. It was designed to be a place where you could be very comfortable as a pedestrian. And indeed, it had a truly remarkable international, global feel, while at the same time you were constantly aware that you're in an Arabic country. And at night, just like the city of Dubai and many other cities around the world, the buildings are lit up, and it really does become quite fantastic. And I never tired of walking around. I was there, Gordon arranged for us to be there for about 2 weeks, and I spent most of those nights wandering around. In order to get an impression of the site from above, there was this tower, which they called the Garden in the Sky. And from the top, you could look down on all the various pavilions and the pedestrian walkways. And in a minute, I'm going to show you that striped colored dome as well. Looking around the site, in the foreground there was a wonderful sculptural piece, which was a waterfall. And indeed, water was very much a theme throughout the pavilion. And then that dome in the middle was the center, if you like, of the three intersecting circles. And that's the town square, the public plaza. It was very interesting getting around the site. If you didn't want to walk, you could take these various forms of transportation. When I heard that the Expo Explorer was compressed air, I must confess I got down on my hands and knees to see if in fact it was sitting up off the ground, and it wasn't. But the motor is actually runs through compressed air, which is a first for me. And of course, there were electric bikes and other ways of getting around. Now, by the way, I went online to learn a little more about the compressed air and discovered that if you want to take a tour of the Expo site, there are a number of videos available. In addition, there was the transportation linking all the neighborhoods. It's the first time I got on a bus and the driver said, "Next stop, sustainability." The taxis are, of course, these electric golf carts, which could take you around. And indeed, the first stop for me was to go down to the Canada Pavilion. Now, even if I had the rest of the day, I could not explain to you what the Canada Pavilion was trying to tell visitors. It was very poetic and very obscure. I was also disturbed when I read that all these wooden pieces originally came from British Columbia and were then sent to France for fabrication. And I just don't want to know how much all of that cost. But at night, you could go into the dome and listen to the music and watch productions, and the lights are flashing, and my hotel room looked out over this, and it really was quite marvelous. So let's quickly take a look around the sustainability district. Like Expo 86, there were a number of theme pavilions. This is the sustainability pavilion with these large canopies, which collect not only solar, but rainwater. And indeed, the rainwater isn't used throughout the building, but it's used to cool the building. And on the outside was this very creative graphic, which tried to show the growth of energy consumption and CO2 emissions over the centuries. And it really was quite creative and quite well done. But inside the pavilion really did force you to start to think about our values and the way we consume. The whole of consumption was a place that was quite delightful. And indeed, you really did begin to rethink some of your values. In fact, one of the things was this display, which prompted you to think about, if your home was burning, what would be the 3 things that you would save? And they developed a major exhibit examining the values of people from around the world, something for you to think about this afternoon. Coincidentally, I thought of Sam when I was here, because there's this banner mentioning how currently, based on our consumption, we need 1.7 Earths. And it was Sam who first introduced me to the one planet concept about many, many years ago. And of course, this was geared not just to local and international visitors, but of all ages, including youth. As an architect who enjoys wood, I was delighted to see many of the pavilions, countries that are not necessarily associated with wood, but choosing wood as their exterior material. Anyone who's been to Singapore or studied Singapore planning knows they're making a very concerted effort to green the city, to green all the buildings, and that was illustrated in their pavilion. And while you can't read all of this, I will make this presentation available to everybody who's interested, and you can go through it more slowly when you get a chance. The Swedes cleverly knew that people would like to see wood, but they'd also like to see this wonderful new electric sports car and some ideas about planning the city. The German pavilion was marvelous, and they set it up as a kind of a campus to teach sustainability. And what was interesting is when I first arrived, they asked me for my name and where I was from. And I quickly discovered why they asked me. It's because they were customizing all of the exhibits to my particular interests. So in fact, you can see here, Michael, the population forecast for your cities of the future. And it started to run through all the Canadian cities. This display looked at the energy consumption and fossil fuel and renewable in countries around the world relative to our city, to our country. And this is a German concept. Like the rest of the world, we're all slowly trying to wean ourselves off of fossil fuel. So I was interested to see that in Canada, and this related to energy consumption, not automobiles, but in buildings, we are now 63% renewable, which of course is feasible because of all the hydro. I mentioned at the beginning how the elevator was first introduced at World Fair. This is the first time I've seen this elevator. It's a German design that not only goes up and down, but also goes horizontally. And some very fascinating exhibits on new renewable materials made out of recycled products. And of course, flying machines. And like many of you, I suspect, I've been fascinated by flying machines. In Germany, there was this this electric plane that is currently in production. It's not mass produced yet, but being developed. But from there, I went to the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, they gave us all the umbrellas. I thought, my God, is it going to rain inside the pavilion? No, it didn't rain, but they used the umbrellas as the projection screens so that you could watch the presentations. But water was very much a theme because the Dutch were demonstrating how you can now extract water out of the desert air. And I must admit, I was surprised by this. I'm ignorant on it. And when I mentioned that to someone, they said, you should have been here a couple of weeks ago. And I said, why? And they said, well, because in the UAE, they actually send drones up into the air to seed the clouds and make it rain. I said, does it work? They said, not only does it work, we actually flooded out a number of the Canadian and other pavilions 2 weeks ago. So it was ironic. While we were having floods in British Columbia, the Canadian pavilion, Dubai, was being flooded. The Czechs also had a display that focused on this concept of taking water out of air and creating new cities. When I was in New Zealand, I loved the country. Here, though, I learned about this notion that the government has actually given a river a legal identity as a way of protecting it, like they protect the rights of a citizen. Water is a big topic. There were no plastic bottles on the site. All the water, even the water in my hotel room, came in a tin can. And I went into this display and purchased this water bottle, which I could then scan the QR code and get cold water, still or sparkling, flavored or unflavored, throughout the site. And there's a very concerted effort now in the UAE to limit and eliminate the use of plastic bottles. The mobility district was equally interesting. The main pavilion by Foster of UK is just a fantastic structure. And I will mention that 80% of the infrastructure and the buildings will be reused. And I'll touch on that near the end. Inside were these marvelous displays of Arabic history, history of explorers. And I have to confess, I spent a few minutes staring at these models because I was convinced they were blinking. They were so realistic. And as I said, if they were standing, they'd be 50 feet tall. But lots of displays about the history of mobility, but also some interesting ideas about the future. So for instance, I bought my first electric car in 2013, and I bought it because I saw a lot of displays of electric vehicles when I was at the Shanghai World Fair. But it is interesting that I believe that they would eventually take off, and indeed they are. I mean, in Norway, 86% of the sales. But it's interesting that electric cars are not only going to, I think, reduce energy consumption and CO2 emissions, they're actually going to reduce accidents. And of course, in the bottom right, talking not just about the cars that are electric, but the planes. Now, this is not electric, but this is a plane that I wanted to buy. But I have to go to Slovakia. I can buy it in Bratislava for 150,000 euros. And it's a gyroplane, I guess a kind of a hybrid between a helicopter and a plane. And this is mass market now. And the attendant assured me that it wouldn't take me long to get a driver's license. I don't need a driver's license for the eco capsules, which again, create their own energy and their own water supply through rainwater capture. Throughout the pavilion, you would see these various quotations. And I must say, they began to take on a greater significance. The idea that world fairs help us transfer some of these ideas across deserts, across oceans, from one group to the other. And when I saw that Steve Jobs quotation in the top left there, I thought of you, Sam, and some of your early work in terms of changing the world. Some of the pavilions were just beautiful. Australia, the Korean, in addition to my Samsung phone, they gave me another Samsung phone when I arrived, which started to help me understand and visualize things through virtual reality. It was all too sophisticated for me, but the younger people seemed to have no difficulty seeing things that I couldn't see, but it was marvelous. And this brings us to Russia. And before I went, I mentioned on Facebook that I was going, and I received a message from Sergei Choban to let me know that he had designed the Russian pavilion. And Sergei is an architect I met when I was working in Moscow and in Kazakhstan. And I think most people would agree, came up with a marvelous concept for the exterior of the building. I see somebody's trying to get in from the waiting room there, Lynn. Maybe we should let him in. So, of course, there's a sad irony looking at the Russian pavilion, especially today with all the tragic events that are taking place in the Ukraine. But one of the things they wanted to do was show us all of their inventions. But the inside was really quite impressive with this display of the brain. But the irony, the real irony, was this display that focused on the importance of world cooperation. And one of the reasons why the Russians were trying to be so great, oh yes, and if you weren't interested in that, you could buy Putin gear, clothing. If you didn't want clothing, you could buy Putin housewares. I mean, it's just so bloody disturbing, this man. But they wanted you to open up your heart to Moscow because Russia wants to be the city for the 2030 World Fair. And I came back and I posted on Twitter that I personally would be happy to give them the World Fair if they agree to get out of Ukraine. Speaking of Ukraine, I did add a couple of pictures from their pavilion. They had this truck or this vehicle, but when I researched it, I discovered the headquarters for the company is not only in Kyiv, but in Winnipeg. And on the right there, these solar blinds. And I'd never really thought about solar blinds, but it seemed like a good idea. The French pavilion was marvelous. I put in that little logo mark though, because now in Europe, whenever you buy a property, the energy rating of the property, whether new or existing, is advertised. One of the things I found fascinating in their pavilion were these flying whales, which are in operation, not widely, but used to transport goods. The Chinese pavilion really, as somebody said to me in a lineup, it was obviously designed by men for men. It was all about trains and cars. It was a bit disappointing. So was the Italian, because the theme was how beauty connects people. But I have to admit, I didn't find that a particularly beautiful pavilion, but there were a lot of interesting sustainability features, as there were in Austria, which took its shape of its pavilion from the historic wind towers, a very original, creative idea, copied by the Spaniards. Opportunity District. The main pavilion was really quite interesting in terms of presenting ideas about various approaches to energy consumption, water conservation, recycling, reuse. But one of the displays fascinated me. I'd never heard of this, but how in Peru, a gentleman who was having trouble irrigating his crops managed to start collecting water from fog using these fog catchers. The Saudi pavilion was marvelous, an architectural and engineering masterpiece. And if you look at the underside of that building at night, it was all lit up. And it became a screen for all sorts of productions and messaging and so forth. And inside, afterwards, you really felt like you'd been to Saudi Arabia. This intrigued me. Bahrain. How many people know that Bahrain is the third densest country in the world after China and India? I didn't know that, but it was a fascinating pavilion. It's aluminum because that's a major product. And inside, it was a clever concept. The structure was all these simple poles, the theme being each one worked together, but there were no major structures. When I saw, though, the McLaren, I said, gee, I didn't know you manufactured McLarens in Bahrain. They said, we don't, but we own 60% of the company. The Pakistani pavilion was a gorgeous pavilion on the outside and some wonderful displays inside. And And now I'm going to take you to one of the two minor districts, because that's where the home theater, the home pavilion was, the UAE. And designed by Calatrava. It was a giant falcon, and it flew. Well, it didn't actually fly, but those wings all moved, and it really was quite impressive. And at night, it was beautiful. But what I really wanted to show you was some of the messaging inside. Again, creating more sustainable forms of concrete and really trying to make the environment healthier. And again, the irony of a country where so much of the wealth came from fossil fuels is telling you that their dream is to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. So when Gordon Price goes to this fair, he's going to find out whether this is just greenwashing or for real. I'm going to quickly finish off here. Again, from World Fairs, flying machines. This is a device that some of you may know about that is going to speed up transportation one day. This I thought was fascinating. This is the National Oil Company wanting us to reimagine energy. And indeed, on the outskirts of the site, they built a service station of the future with hydrogen and electric and a LEED platinum gas station. So to conclude, around the site in the washrooms, all sorts of interesting graffiti, messaging, things that you wouldn't normally expect to read in an Arabic country, gender-sensitive washrooms. This, I thought, was a statistic that was rather disturbing, but apparently is true, that more people have a mobile phone than access to a flushing toilet. In addition to all the people wandering around the site, there were these robots. And after a while, you became quite attached to some of them because they'd come up, they talk to you, they ask you questions, you'd answer your questions. So as we leave the site, it was really quite marvelous. Again, a beautiful, beautiful place. But what I'll leave you with at this point is that what's going to happen to all this? And just like our Expo site became a future community, that's what's planned here. But interestingly, a community that's entirely different than the rest of Dubai. I mean, the planner who I met was telling me we're working around 1.52 FSR average for these plans, and that we're going to reuse as much as we possibly can. And I plan to go back and see it, just as I hope to see in Shanghai. So for those of you who are not going to get to this World Fair, you may be wondering, where's the next World Expo? And it's only going to be in a couple of years. And it's going to be in Japan, in Osaka, where they'll design the future of our society. So hopefully, Sam, I'm going to stop now so that I can make sure Tom has enough time to explain his presentation and we can have some conversation. But I hope the audience found this of some interest.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thanks for giving that history about how powerful these expositions have been ever since 1851, the Crystal Pavilion. Now I just want to let you know that if anybody has any questions, please direct the message to Sebastian or put it on the chat. And thank you for mentioning this very, very serious issue with Ukraine. It's so frightening. We don't seem to know how frightening the whole thing is. So be very thoughtful today about what's going on there. So Tom Davidoff, degrees from Harvard, Princeton, MIT, Sauder School of Business, UBC, where each year 100 students really learn from him about urban economics and issues like that. Like our last guest speaker, Michael Geller, Tom is an active participant in the public discourse about community and development. And it's very interesting because when he speaks, government listens. Two programs that come to mind, British Columbia's speculation tax and the city of Vancouver's Making Home project, home standing for housing options for middle income earners. He has some very interesting insights that have relevance to, for example, Alain Bertaud's emphasis on the density gradients, and he writes that in Order Without Design. So, Tom, come on down and make your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I'll just quickly say, of course, what's happening in Ukraine is horrendous. It's been 130 years or so since the Davidoffs have been in Odessa, but for anybody dealing with suffering with that, obviously, hope it goes a little less badly. Anyway, I want to spend 30 minutes trying to explain what it would take me 90 minutes to explain to a room full of economists. So we'll see how it goes. This is a paper, Housing Appreciation and Marginal Land Supply, that's joint with my former doctoral student, Jacob Kosman, and Joe Williams, who used to be here at UBC, now works in industry. The purpose of the paper is to better understand the links between supply constraints and price growth, and to establish a link between price gradients, the urban gradient that Sam mentioned, that Alain also does at great length. The purpose of the lunch talk is to communicate the ideas and results, and hopefully at the end link the ideas in the paper to our shared, mostly Vancouver environment. So by way of background, Albert Saiz wrote a really brilliant and important paper in 2010 pointing out ways that we can measure supply elasticity in cities. And he talks about regulations, which are a big problem because they're endogenous, right? Is Vancouver expensive because we have difficult regulations is a really, really hard question to answer because regulations don't come up in cities where people don't want to live. If you don't have growing demand, there's no reason to impose tight land use regulations. He has an instrumental variable strategy for that. But what our paper is going to build on is his measurement of land lost to water and steep slopes. And so for a long time, the industry standard when saying, well, is one market more elastic than another market in terms of supply? Can they withstand demand growth and still not see price growth? One way to approach that is to say, well, where is there more land to build on? And the intuition is where there's more land available, less water, more flatness, you'll be able to accommodate more demand with meeting it with supply, rather with housing unit growth, rather than housing price growth. Okay, and so you look at Vancouver, a lot of water and mountains, and you think, okay, probably going to see price growth as demand grows because there's nowhere to build. So that makes us think supply is inelastic. However, just like regulations are endogenous, and seeing a correlation between price growth and regulations is a no-no. Unfortunately, even though it is God that gave us mountains and oceans, unlike man that gave us regulations, even those, seeing a correlation between price growth and water and mountains is not enough to establish a causal relationship, that absence of ability to build on flat land leads to price growth. Why is that? Well, look at these two pictures, right? Our ancient selves, maybe mammalian pre-human on the right, we're in a flat area, no water, no slopes, and that dinosaur can dine on us very easily, right? We can't run away from a dinosaur there. Whereas I believe, Michael would know better than I, there's something called prospect refuge theory, that, standing on a prospect, a hill with a view, and overlooking water makes us feel calm and relaxed, just like this guy doing Warrior 2. If a dinosaur is coming after you, you can jump into the water. He's only coming from one direction, so you'll be able to see him from miles away. And so people like mountains and oceans. And as the income distribution shifts to the right, superstar cities like Vancouver, San Francisco, Boston, places that have slopes and or water might become more expensive, even having nothing to do with supply constraints. So the fraction of buildable land that's covered by water or mountains, kind of a problem to talk about it, how that causes price growth, because maybe it's the demand rather than supply role. So to emphasize that, here are, by my calculations, the 10 metropolitan areas with the least amount of flat buildable land within 25 kilometers of downtown, and then the 10 with the most. And what I'd like you to do is look at this slide and see which of these cities you'd most like to go to vacation on and see if there's a pattern, okay? So the 10 cities with the least buildable land in the US close to downtown, Santa Cruz, Barnstable, which is Cape Cod, Naples, Florida, Atlantic City, New Jersey, Oxnard, California, north of LO, San Luis Obispo, San Francisco, Ocean City, New Jersey, New Orleans, and Myrtle Beach. So all of these, I think, are places where we might imagine going on vacation. I'm going to conjecture that other than going to funerals or bar mitzvahs or something, none of us, and probably not a lot of bar mitzvahs, frankly, none of us would want to go for vacation to the 10 cities that have the most buildable land. Hanford, California, Odessa, Texas, Champaign-Urbana, Midland, Texas, Lubbock, Texas, Lincoln, Nebraska, Decatur, Illinois, Lima, Ohio, Springfield, Ohio, Wichita, Kansas, right? Obviously, these are very different metropolitan areas. They're different on the supply side, they're different on the demand side. Very hard to talk about average buildability within some distance and claim a causal role as a supply constraint as opposed to a demand shifter. Okay, so what do we build? What do we provide? Well, let's look at what it is that makes for price growth. And you'll pardon a very trivial hand drawing here, very un-Michael Geller-like. On the vertical axis, we have money, and on the horizontal axis, we have distance to downtown. So downtown is over here at the origin, and we think there's willingness to pay curves for land. If you ask how much will somebody pay or rent a unit for, holding constant the quality of the unit, the further you get away from downtown, the lower the rent, okay? And there's some opportunity cost of developing agricultural land into homes. Our paper ignores infill, which, you know, too bad, so sad. We have to do it for analytical purposes, of course, not a great approximation. But the way the city grows is you have a demand shifter that says people are willing to pay more to live in the city. Maybe there's more people. Maybe they, there's just natural population growth. Maybe there's more money. People have more money to spend to live in this metropolitan area. So you move from the black willingness to pay to the red willingness to pay, and rents grow at any given location. Why are they growing? Because the boundary is shifting out. And one way to look at an urban rent is your rent is the opportunity cost of development, you know, construction cost plus foregone agricultural value, maybe plus some option costs we can talk about with questions. Okay, that's a relatively fixed number. Interior locations have higher rents than this opportunity cost because they're better locations. So your rent is going to grow over time or price as the product of how far has the boundary shifted. That is, how much better have you become than this opportunity cost times the steepness of this gradient. If you live in a city with no urban gradient, which may happen with work from home, there's no price growth because the boundary just shifts out and every location is just as good as the boundary. But in a New York or a San Francisco, it's a different story. You really want to be close to downtown. And so as the border shifts out, as this gradient is steeper, the more the boundary shifts out, the bigger is price growth, okay? So then the question is, in which metropolitan areas does the boundary have to grow further in percentage terms? And the answer there is, in terms of buildable land, what matters for the percentage growth in the boundary, which will drive the percentage growth in price and that we're interested in, it's not how much land do you have, it's how much land is there at the border right around this boundary relative to how much land there is in the interior. That is, prices are going to grow in two kinds of metropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas where the boundary has to grow a lot to accommodate growth because there's not enough land at the boundary. And we could think about regulations having a role there too. And second, in cities where there's a steep gradient, no price growth, no matter how much the boundary grows. And a hope, a fond hope that we might have is that maybe, not maybe, maybe the marginal average ratio of buildability is really a supply measure. That is, clearly mountains and oceans are a demand shifter. But what we're saying is just moving the mountains and the water from downtown to the urban fringe should be associated with price growth. And you could believe for a given fraction of land that's buildable, just shifting it to the edge of the metropolitan area could be a pure supply effect, not a demand effect, because water and mountains are amenities, whether they're close to downtown or around a boundary. Okay, so conditional on how much average buildable land there is, maybe this fringe buildability is a pure supply shifter. So here's some pictures of cities. Here's Los Angeles, a city with a lot of price growth. These red areas are my best guess of where the urban boundary is, and I can take questions on that. And what you can see is you have the LA basin, which is pretty buildable, but as you get farther and farther away from downtown, you get less and less buildable. You run into the Pacific Ocean, you run into the mountains around Pasadena. So darker on this map means lighter, green means totally unbuildable because of water. And sure enough, LA is a city that has not a lot of land to build on and less when you get far away from downtown. So in these areas where construction we think is prone to happen, you have less land than you used to, and that should be associated with price growth, which maybe explains LA's spectacular price growth. On the other hand, Ocean City, New Jersey, near Atlantic City, I guess that's a Jersey Shore city, here you don't really have that issue. In fact, in some directions, as you get inland, you actually have more buildable land when you get away from the core downtown than you did leading into the downtown. Okay, so that's marginal to buildable land. The other thing that drives price growth is a gradient. And using land value data from Davis, Oliner, Larson, and Shui, what we've done is to compute the gradient in prices with respect to distance. So a blue dot, these axes, by the way, are longitude and latitude. So this is just a standard map. Downtown is the center of this picture. Here's Toledo, Ohio. And the size of the blue dot indicates the value of a standard lot. And in Toledo, moving away from downtown, not really a negative. So in Toledo, you can continue to sprawl, and it's not going to mean you're going on worse land. If the land at the fringe of the metro area is a good enough substitute for downtown, no price growth. Here's Boston, and you see a very different pattern, right? Boston famously has downtown, it has Cambridge, where Harvard and MIT are, but as you get away from the core, you get some really baby blue dots. Lands far away from downtown, not a great substitute, and so as the metropolitan area grows, we expect price growth. College Station, Texas, forget about. Here's San Francisco. Now, San Francisco is a funny metro area because it's polycentric. You've got downtown, you've got Silicon Valley, you sort of have the East Bay, but it's very clear that there's a land value gradient. As you get away from downtown San Francisco, the dots get smaller. That means a standard lot is cheaper farther away from downtown. Here's New York, another metropolitan area that's considered inelastic supply, and it's extreme here. You really want to be close to downtown. Going further out towards the fringe, there's land available to build on, but it's not as good as the land downtown, so we'd expect prices to grow as demand grows. Phoenix, Arizona, which had tremendous price growth from 2000 roughly to 2005, there was a bust there, not surprisingly, because Phoenix is not a city with much of a land value gradient. There's a fairly big area over which lots have similar value. Surprisingly to me, Dallas and Houston are sort of famous among urban economists for being no gradient cities that can sprawl and sprawl because no one wants to be downtown. The data indicate otherwise. Both Dallas and Houston have significant land value gradients. Okay, I actually think I'm talking plenty fast. Okay, so regression results support the model, and I'm not sure if you can read these. We measure running out of land in 3 different ways. One is to measure an elasticity of how buildable land is with respect to downtown. So we take 2.5 kilometer bands, right? So these are 2.5 kilometer wide bands. From 0 is downtown, here's east, here's west, up is north, down is south. And so we go 2.5 kilometer band by 2.5 kilometer band, and this measure XC, whoops, in the regressions, this first level says, is land getting more scarce as you get away from downtown from 0 to 50 kilometers? And this is a regression where the dependent variable is price growth from 1990 to 2018. An observation is a US metropolitan area for which there's home price growth. And what you can see is, consistent with our model, there's a big effect of this running out of land parameter C. A 1% increase would be associated with 28 basis points greater growth over a long period. Okay, lambda is sort of kind of a measure of average land availability, and that's associated negatively with growth, but not as much so as this running out of land parameter. The urban gradient, in every specification, we find the steeper the land rent gradient, the more valuable land is downtown relative to into the suburbs. If you can read this gradient line, that's the places with greater price growth, and that's always a significant factor. We include some demand controls. Unfortunately, there's race stuff in the US, so we control for the African American population as of 1980, the college education share as of 1980, a Bartik instrument which measures how well the industries that composed the local workforce in 1980 performed between 1980 and 2010. A measure for foreign born, which could go both ways and has no real effect. So those are the demand controls. Then we measure marginal to average buildable land in a couple of other ways. And one way is to look at land, sort of just a ratio. How much land F is there at what we think the urban boundary is? And in the picture of Los Angeles, these red areas, we look at average buildability here, which is right where about 50% of buildable land is developed. So we think that's the fringe, that's B, the margin between urban and agricultural land. And in these areas, we look at how much is buildable there, that's F, and A is what fraction of land is buildable inside the urban fringe. And sure enough, and this is, I think a pretty interesting finding, consistent with the model, okay, buildable land interior to downtown is associated with more price growth. So actually having a lot of buildable land, you'd think low buildable land is associated with price growth. In the interior, that's not true. Where it matters that you have low buildability land is in the exterior, that marginal. So average buildable land, positively associated with price growth. Marginal buildable land, the elasticity of buildable land with respect to distance from downtown, that's the predicted negative sign. And then we can also measure that so-called exogenously by looking at 0 to, I think, 37 kilometers and 37 to 50. So half the land area out to 50 kilometers. And you get the same thing, sort of marginal buildability significantly negatively associated with price growth, but not so land interior close to downtown. So again, average buildable land is associated negatively with price growth, but what really matters is marginal buildability. Now, why do we find these results that way? Well, the reason we find typically, without looking at marginal to average, that average buildability is associated with price growth is you can't have low marginal buildability without having low average buildability. If you're in Topeka, Kansas, and everything's buildable, you've got to be buildable on the fringe as well as downtown. Okay, here's a picture of Vancouver. Do we think Vancouver is a city that should have price growth based on our model? It certainly does empirically. And yeah, it's hard to compare to the US. We don't have land value transactions as readily. We do have tear downs. My colleagues, Bob Helsley and Stuart Rosenthal many years ago wrote a paper estimating land values, but here's just Craigslist listings. So holding constant the quality of rental listings, the square feet, the number of beds and bathrooms. Darker red is higher rent. As you get towards the green color scale, it's lower, and not surprisingly, the highest rents, given hedonic quality, are close to downtown, but also on the west side, somewhat on the North Shore. But as you go farther from downtown, particularly into the Fraser Valley and down towards America, you get lower rents. So it is true that if you build at the urban fringe in Vancouver, as we all know, you're substituting better quality with worse quality. So as the boundary expands, urban land in Vancouver gets relatively better and better compared to the urban fringe, and hence reason for price growth. Also, if you look at a satellite picture, I think, and I haven't done this measurement because it's just not as easy with the data, but I think one could do it, we are running out of land. You know, when you start development of the city of Vancouver around City Hall, you don't have a full circle to build on, but, you know, up to the North Shore, you're pretty close. Today, where can you build? You know, on the fringe, going east, not a possibility. You're into water. To the north, not a possibility. You're running into mountains. To the east, a little bit, but even where it's not agricultural reserve, there's just not a lot of land to build on. And south is pretty buildable, but it doesn't count because it's the US. So Vancouver has two hallmarks of, you know, likely to have high price growth. We've got an urban gradient, so the land that you can build on is not as good as the existing land. And number two, where we're building today, there's less land than on average in the metropolitan area. Now, I do want to show some warts. The model predicts that you have higher price growth in these areas where you're running out of good land because it's hard to add housing units. But if you run a regression of housing quantity growth on these elasticity of supply variables, you don't find it. That's something I had showed about the SAIS paper. It's not true that places with low average buildable land or low marginal land are places that have lower quantity growth. Yes, more price growth, not more quantity growth. That makes you worry that even marginal to average land might not be clean of demand. That is, it may not be a pure supply effect. You know, it sure seems like it ought to be because, you know, mountains and oceans are nice wherever they are, but maybe recreation at the urban fringe is more important than closer in. And maybe it signals as you get even further out, there's more recreational opportunities. Okay, some Vancouver specific considerations. If you think about where our price is likely to grow, the ongoing land value gradient is an important consideration. Now, part of the reason you want to be in downtown and the west side of Vancouver is recreational amenity rather than work. But if people can work from home, Vancouver and of course Toronto are at a lot of risk of lower price growth going forward, because if you can work from home, supply becomes very elastic because now you can live in Squamish, you can live even in Kelowna and work in Vancouver potentially. So whether work from home is going to end or whether it'll persist and these land value gradients are going to be flat is an incredibly important question for thinking about price growth going forward. Our model does not have infill. So if we think about the elasticity of supply in Vancouver, it's not that little fringe of buildable land in the Fraser Valley. A lot of what's buildable is what we allow people to build on. So of course, the Making Home proposal, which I didn't know what it stood for, Sam. It should have been Making Homey, which would have been a preference of mine coming from New York. But you know, allowing and encouraging infill, zoning for dollars, so to speak, is a really good approach. And laneway homes, which Sur Somerville, Andre Pavlov, and I have written about, are another one. And of course, just generally allowing teardowns and towers is an important form of elasticity of supply here. It's a lot of material in a short amount of time, but happy to take questions if there's any time left.
Thank you so much, Tom. We just have a few minutes. Sebastian is, and I know for some people it will be a little bit, you know, difficult with the technical nature of the presentation. But Sebastian, do you have any questions that you've received?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. It feels like it's 2017 again, and I'm in your class. That's a very good thing. Just so we walk through the central mechanic of that model again. Planners often talk about spreading amenities or jobs throughout a region as a kind of affordability strategy. But under this model, if I understand it correctly, it shows how that could simply increase land values at the fringe and negate the affordability effect of being at the fringe. Is that correct?
Well, that's always an interesting question, what sprawl does. I mean, obviously there's commuting and congestion issues, and, you know, having diffuse employment seems good because people can work from home. But on the other hand, you get into cross commuting, which can be a mess. So, you know, whether you solve urban problems by dispersing from downtown, you know, my instinct is it should reduce prices, that a polycentric city, all else would be cheaper than a monocentric city, but that's pretty complicated.
I see Michael has his hand up.
So I've often said that we're not running out of land. We're just not making very good use of the land we already have. And while you did mention the idea of densification, I've often thought there's tremendous opportunity just looking at all the parking lots in the region, especially as attitudes change towards parking, and also rethinking the mixing of uses so that all of that industrial land, which is light industry, it's not noxious industry. I've often thought all of that industrial land is potential residential land as well. Now, can you factor things like that into your projections?
Well, you know, obviously you get into that contentious issue of what do you call it? Just not getting it on the fly. Whatever capacity, zone capacity. You know, measuring vacant land is sort of from satellite imagery. You can do it, but God, what a data exercise! I don't know if Jens is here, but ask him about sort of maybe redevelopable. That's a really hard one, but important, of course.
Now, I guess I'll have to butt in here because we're very close to our 1 o'clock, and I did want to ask Alain Bertaud to make a few comments to lead us to the end. Thank you, Alain.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to that. As usual, those presentations are very stimulating, and God knows if I need stimulating my brain those days. And the first presentation by Michael, I think, was inspiring because, and interestingly enough, a lot of people who are thinking of solving the problem of global warming are thinking about reducing the economy, going back to the Middle Ages. And Michael, I think in his presentation, is in fact saying that it's innovation and technology which can get us out of there, rather than just shrinking completely the economy, which is not so common in the US, but in Europe, I find it very disturbing that people think that literally going back to the Middle Ages will solve the problem. I think it's opposite. And then, of course, the presentation of Tom was extremely interesting for me. There is one aspect, though, that the amenities, when we talk about amenities in general, but say a high concentration of high-valued amenities, the type of thing you have in the center of London or Paris or New York, that also, I think, affects the gradient, certainly. I see now more and more monitoring the commuting pattern of people who live in the center of Paris. 30% of them have a job outside Paris, and sometimes even outside the Ile-de-France. They commute more than 1 hour, but living in the center of Paris because of the amenities. And that, of course, must increase the gradients and the slope of the gradient.
Yeah.
But that, again, very difficult to measure, really, in the same way as the zoning capacity, extremely difficult to measure. I mean, in New York, if you want to measure really what the zoning allow, you need a lawyer and work for 1 month to know really what it is.
Yeah, Jacob and I, in an earlier iteration, measured the gravitational pull of Starbucks as one sort of way to get at a more generalized thing.
Listen, I'm sorry that we're going to have to cut it off here, but I am so grateful for two men here who have gone above and beyond what their career, roles would indicate, and actually participate truly and deeply in the public discourse. And to have such knowledgeable people do that, we are so grateful and so lucky to have both of you here. And of course, Alain, the efforts that you made to share your 50 years of experience in as a World Bank Chief Urban Planner. How all of us are so grateful. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you to our speakers.